The Game Maker's Toolkit Game Jam. You've probably heard of it before. It's kind of the biggest jam out there, and the one that most people are familiar with. Well, this summer I decided that I needed a challenge, a bit of a break from work on my main project, and a chance to develop some more game dev skills. And I figured, what better way to do that than to take part in a game jam? In all the years I've followed it, the GMTK jam has used some really interesting themes, and it provides a big enough time window that I could see myself getting a project done by the deadline. So that was the one that I went with. Time to take you along the journey of completing my first ever game jam. But before we begin, make sure to join my Discord where you can see updates and progress on the different games and projects I'm working on. I'm just getting started on building that community, but it'll be a great place for all things game development. I'm also planning on doing a Q&A when I reach 1,000 subscribers, so leave any questions you have for me in the comments or in my Discord. With that, let the jam begin. The theme for this year's jam was Roll of the Dice. The jam itself took place in July, so why am I uploading now of all times? Isn't it a bit late? Well, yes, but as school got started back up, I kind of got sidetracked, homework and stuff were getting overloaded, and I really didn't have enough time to work on videos. But now that I'm getting more into the swing of things, I figure it's time to get back to the channel. Now, when I heard the theme Roll of the Dice, obviously the first thing that came to mind was a game centered around rolling dice of some variety. However, I couldn't really get an idea that I was satisfied with, so I decided to focus more on the randomness of the theme. Having my game center around a random mechanic of sorts would be a great way to keep the theme while being able to add more of a personal spin to it. With that in mind, I got to work immediately. Is what I would say if I hadn't been on the road for the next 6 hours. I had just gotten off a flight when I found out the theme, so most of the drive was just spent on brainstorming in a notebook. I did get some ground for my idea in that time, though. While there was still some solid ideas bouncing around in my head, the one that had caught my focus the most was centered around a broken life support system that fills an oxygen tank to a random amount. Most of the game's mechanics were fleshed out in this notebook, as you can see, and I made a list of things that I would need to create, both art and code-wise. After I got home, it was time to get cracking. I didn't have much time the first night of the jam, but in those few hours I got the overall art theme decided and nailed down a final character. An astronaut stranded on an alien planet who has to fix their spaceship's life support to escape. But after that, I went to sleep nice and early. The next day was going to be where the pedal hit the metal. Saturday, July 16th, I woke up nice and early, grabbed myself a quick shower and a cup of cider, and sat down to get to work. The first task at hand, and perhaps the most important one, was to get started on the art. I'd already drawn out the astronaut's basic form the night before, but it was time for animations. I created most of the art in the same style as my main project, Honor for Hire, to make sure the process of art and animation went as smoothly as possible with the limited time I had available. That made creating the player and its animations much simpler than it otherwise would be. The final product came out quite nice. It's similar to some of my other walk animations, but it has a bouncy feel appropriate for the low gravity of the alien world. I didn't want to focus on one part at a time though, so I ended up bouncing back and forth between engine and art for the entirety of the project. Coding the player's movement was simple enough, and getting the animations attached was a matter of storing the direction the character is facing and checking its velocity. But once that was done, my options for what to work on next were staggering. This is when the true scale of a game jam was first made apparent to me. I'd obviously considered everything that has to go into a game in order to make it a full product, but most of the things I'd be doing were new to me. Honor for Hire still doesn't have a menu, sound effects, or music, so everything involving that would have to be done on the fly for the first time. But at this point I wasn't too worried about that. I still had to get my basic scene layout done and figure out when and how the character would switch scenes. My idea was to have the character enter and leave the planet scene with rocket blast animations. I already had a handy screen transition made, so I used that for hopping between scenes. Finally, I made this animation that I'm pretty proud of. The rocket door opens and the character jets up out of it, flying off to the planet. But how did I actually handle the character changing scenes? This is where we get into the long, boring systems talk. So this line of code is quite the interesting one. It has an extremely complicated... Nah, just kidding. The basic explanation is that the game logs key presses to determine whether you want to leave the scene. Once you've pressed enter, the launch key, twice, the character blasts off. I can also disable the character's movement through a simple boolean so you can't, I don't know, slide sideways while launching off the planet. The rocket scene that I briefly showcased earlier is where you return every time your oxygen is running low and is one of the most important parts of the game. Not only does the random oxygen refill happen here, something I'll talk about shortly, you also get to see the number of launches your jetpack still contains, as well as the fragments of the shattered life support. This would be a bit difficult to implement and carry between scenes if it weren't for my favorite Godot feature, global variables. Godot games can give scripts the auto-load feature, which means that no matter the scene you're in, the script will load. This is extremely helpful for keeping track of collected objects, oxygen levels, warnings, you name it, and it can probably be made into a global variable. I didn't lay out the world that day, but I did make the scene that the character can return to and added in the 6 fragments of the life support system that need repairing, a fun little design that I got to break into pieces. Each of the fragments has its own global collected variable that I can turn to true whenever the character overlaps it in the world scene. Then when you return to the rocket scene, it accesses the global variable, checks if the fragment has been grabbed, and turns them visible one at a time. I also designed the tile set, something that remained pretty consistent even with all the other changes I was making. I really wanted to capture the feel of an alien world, so I spent a couple hours designing it and refining each part of it. Another important part of returning to the rocket is the main random mechanic of the game, and another one that uses global variables, the character's oxygen level. By creating a variable named RNG and assigning it a new random number generator, I can create a random number in any range, and every time the character gets back to the rocket, the oxygen tanks are set to a random value between 40 and 100. The tanks then run down by 1 every second through a timer attached to the character, sending you to a game over screen if it hits 0. Now, it might seem unfair if you randomly drop dead on the planet because your oxygen ran out, and that was the most important balance dilemma that I came across. I had to keep it fair, but interesting. The way I ended up doing this was by making an alarm go off not when the oxygen had a certain amount of time left, but when it hit a percentage of its original fill for that run. This felt much better in terms of balance, but if I were to improve the game, I've got a couple of potential changes lined up. First off, I would make the random amount more interactive. Perhaps make the player roll a die that gives a number between 1 and 6, but not tell them what that number means, truly embodying the roll of the dice theme. The calculations wouldn't be too difficult to implement, I just have to make a die roll animation with 6 outcomes, which might be a little more difficult. The other change I would make is putting the oxygen warning at a higher amount. The tension I could create by having it go off at 50% tank level would be much better than knowing it's almost out. The value I used in the final game was 20%, which amounts to 20 seconds at the very most and 10 at the least. 50% would also allow the player to time the first half and take their expedition right up to the wire. But the warning system turned out pretty solid, and I like how it is in the final product. I designed a neat label that flashes when the oxygen gets to that 20% threshold, and it also works with the next part of the project I worked on, topping off Saturday night, sound effects and music. I played around with a lot of sound effects for the UI I created earlier in the day. In the end, I settled on a pretty solid package of effects that I used throughout the entire game for my various buttons and interactions. Godot's audio system is thankfully very easy to work with, and even though I had never done any audio in the engine before, I was able to get it implemented and coded quite quickly. The music, alarm, and rocket sound effects were not part of the audio pack, so I had to find those individually, but I got ones that I think are a pretty good fit for the game. By the time I had that done though, it was already past 10, and I still had to lay out the world and add the final touches. Not to mention upload the game. The next day was going to be quite hectic. On Sunday it was the same deal, wake up early, grab my cider, and get to work. I only got footage from the first part of the day because I was already feeling the pressure from the moment I got out of bed. I still had yet to structure the game properly, add text boxes where necessary, and make an ending to the game, so I got cracking immediately. Most of the text boxes were out of the way quickly, and after struggling for half an hour, I finally found a pixelated font that was willing to import to Godot and function. Laying out the different text boxes wasn't too bad. All I had to do was position them properly and then add a trigger into my pre-existing code to make them appear and disappear. Designing the world, though, was an entirely different story. That took far longer than I expected. I had to work with a ton of different tile variants, and the world had to be big enough to provide an engaging experience, but not be too large. I also had to apply collisions over the entire map, put all the decorations around. Yeah, it was a little rough. It was at this point that I started getting worried. The deadline was only a couple hours off, and designing the world had taken most of my morning up. Luckily, there wasn't a lot of work left to do. All I had to do was lay out the life support fragments where I wanted them and make sure everything was working properly and the time between the fragments felt fair. I then packaged the game up and submitted it to the jam with around 40 minutes left. Yeah, cutting it close, I know. Unfortunately, due to the time crunch I was in that morning, a bug did make it through. I'd forgotten to reset the number of launches the player has when the game ends. By the time you watch this though, it should be fixed and updated on itch.io, the link to which is in the description. So what did I learn from this experience? Put simply, game jams are hard. I knew going in that I would have to move fast and avoid overscoping, and boy was I glad I kept things on the simpler end. As I said previously, the project isn't perfect. I do have improvements that I would make, but I'm satisfied with how it turned out. I'll almost certainly do more game jams in the future, and perhaps you guys could watch me complete one live. I don't know, that depends if I want to start a Twitch channel. Make sure you subscribe to the channel because we are so close to 1,000 subscribers, and hitting that milestone would be absolutely amazing. Don't forget to join the Discord as well, the link to which is in the description. If you've got any questions or suggestions for me, leave them in the comments below. Thank you all for joining me, and take care.